Faith is what makes healing happen through prayer. Then when healing doesn't happen through prayer, do you then assume that that's because of a lack of faith? And you end up blaming the victim, which is not only cruel, but not consistent with medical understandings of such things as germs and DNA, genetics, and so forth. So there's that risk. The alternative is to say, well, it's the will of God. God decides when someone will be healed and when someone won't. But of course, that also brings with it a host of problems. If, say, a human mother or father deliberately infected their child with smallpox because they asserted that it was in the child's long-term best interest, we'd lock them up and put them in jail. So are we really ready to say that God sometimes brings illness upon us or doesn't relieve us from illness because it's God's will? Now, that's a lot more complicated question, but those are a couple of the issues that I think have to be dealt with in any theology of the healing power of prayer. I'd like to briefly offer two approaches to answering these questions and to undergird a theology of prayer, and then leave with a couple of other brief questions. First of all, one approach is simply to acknowledge the limitations of human understanding. And that is, God doesn't have to be a divine child abuser to have understandings and wills for our good that are beyond our capacity to understand. The theological term for this is mystery. There's more going on here than my human intellect can process. They're more involved in the ultimate will of God than in my limited experience of God and God's will. And so I just have to acknowledge my human limits. That plays out in a practical way in the Pentecostal roots from which I come, in the healing ministry of Amy Semple McPherson, who was the founder of the Foursquare Gospel denomination, and that was the church in which I was first ordained back in 1980. And Sister Amy, as they called her, had a widespread healing ministry. And someone asked her one time, well, what would you do if you go out and pray for somebody and they're not healed? And her answer was, that's God's problem, not mine. My job is to go pray for people for healing. That's what God told me to do. That's what the New Testament supports. So I just do that, and the rest of it's God's problem. I think that's a reasonable way to get at this one approach of mystery. A second approach deals with how we define healing, and this is articulated, I think, beautifully in the book of worship of the tradition in which I currently serve, the United Methodist Church. This has to deal with the fact that we now have healing services in the United Methodist Church, and I want to read to you an introduction to the service of healing. God does not promise that we will be cured of all illnesses, and we all must face the inevitability of death. A service of healing, or I would say a prayer for healing, is not necessarily a service of curing, but it provides an atmosphere in which healing can happen. The greatest healing of all is the reunion or reconciliation of a human being with God. When this happens, physical healing sometimes occurs. Mental and emotional balance is often restored. Spiritual health is enhanced, and relationships are healed. For the Christian, the basic purpose of spiritual healing is to renew and strengthen one's relationship with the living Christ. So we take the question of healing beyond curing, which is a specific physical issue, condition, and response, and put it in a broader context. And that broader context of spiritual wholeness, Satoe, this holistic approach, will often have physical effects. But there's some spiritual efficacy and a benefit that's enhanced by an environment of prayer in any event. I'd like to wrap up with just some final thoughts, 3 quick questions I would leave you with. Number 1, what is the purpose of prayer? Is the purpose of prayer primarily to change things or to change us? Is the purpose of prayer to change God's mind, as it were, to persuade God to do something God would not otherwise do? Or is it for us to conform ourselves to God's will and perhaps to better understand it, if not, then to accept it? I think we have to define not only what we mean by healing, but what we mean by prayer and what the purpose of prayer is. Second, are there some persons, like Amy Semple McPherson in the Foursquare Gospel tradition, who seem to have a special facility for prayer or for ministries of healing? I think we shouldn't be too quick to say no. There are undoubtedly charlatans out there who prey on the desperate needs and hopes of innocent people. But there are also persons who do seem that may have some special gift of some kind, but I don't really know about that, so I leave it as a question. And finally, if God does answer prayer, is the answer to that prayer primarily something that happens through human agency, within us or among us, or is that a power that is beyond human agency? To what extent does our prayer, our faith, all these other conditions make this happen, or to what extent is God acting somehow without regard for human agency or ability? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McLemore. Rabbi Schneider, please.
First, let me begin by thanking the Dallas Islamic Center for extending the invitation. I really appreciate being here on this esteemed panel and sharing, being a teacher on behalf of representing, I guess, the Jewish tradition. I ask, how could I summarize this topic in 10 minutes? So I humbly plead for 12. Perhaps the first question that I will address will be, where does prayer come from in the Jewish tradition? Prayer is what we offer to God, very much like the sacrifices that were offered in the ancient temple. But this is a little unclear, because if you say prayer to most people in America, it means asking for things, or perhaps meditating, but not necessarily offering something. But with Jews, it is a little different. Not that we do not ask for things in our prayers, but even this asking is also a form of service. It goes back to the sacrifices I just mentioned. While our ancient temple stood from 2,000 years ago to 3,000 years ago in Jerusalem, the priests who worked in the temple would offer up sacrifices every day, animals and sweet-smelling incense. This was the principal form of worship. Each day in that temple in Jerusalem, the Israelites would make such offerings to God in order to serve Him. And this was our most direct and our constant communication. And then, when the temple was destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era, and sacrifice was no longer possible in the temple, it was as if this reaching out to God might no longer be a possibility. And so our rabbis, in place of sacrificing animals on the altar, came up with a system of offering up our words as the form of worship. And that is where the evolution, if you will, from sacrifices of animals became the sacrifice and offering of words that would go up like the smoke from the sacrifices. Prayer today in Judaism is the complete act of the human spirit, touching all of the faculties, intellectual, emotional, spiritual, and even physical, as in the choreography or the prescribed motions associated with prayer. Such an offering is intended to be complete, the worshipers placing themselves on the metaphorical altar, putting themselves on the line, if you will, in the hopes of a form of acceptance. But a difference, an important difference between prayer and human communication is the assurance of God's acceptance, if not God's assent. Jewish tradition accepts that God will embrace any prayer that is offered willingly